Alright, g'day IB Psychology students. Perhaps the biggest place where students lose marks in their IA is the evaluation. There's some really basic things you need to do that a lot of students miss. So watch this video, I'm going to explain the 5 biggest mistakes so you know not to make these in the future. Alright, so let's get cracking with the last video in this series. Hopefully you've watched the other 3 videos and you've used these to check your IA as you go along. The top 5 mistakes here in the evaluation. Number 5, the limitations are pretty superficial. So part of the evaluation section is you have to explain limitations of the sample, the procedures, and the design. And most limitations, they actually like 1 or so sentences. Make sure that you've got a well-developed explanation of a limitation, and I would focus on validity issues rather than those of practicality. So you're really trying to evaluate your internal validity, and you know, why did you get the results you did? Did you control for all the extraneous variables? Was your experiment well controlled? And perhaps if it wasn't, then you can explain what you did that wasn't so well controlled, and then how that might have influenced the results, and that's how you get a more developed explanation. Number 4 mistake, the strengths are not explained. So often when we think about the evaluation, most people just focus on the limitations, but actually you have to mention, or you have to explain, the strengths of the design, the sample, and the procedures as well. Now, I would say 1 to 2 sentences is enough, and the reason why you can focus more on the limitations and less on the strengths is a couple of reasons. The first one is you should have already explained the strengths of your design and your sampling and your procedures in the exploration section, because you explain how and why you did them. So those reasons aren't going to change. So you kind of repeat a little bit of what you said there, and that's why it's okay just to have this in a little bit less detail. And also we can see here, even in the guide itself, when it talks about what to do in the evaluation, they don't even mention the strengths. Now the rubric mentions the strengths, and that's why you have to write about it. But the focus should definitely be, the focus should be on the limitations of the method and the modifications. Number 3 mistake made in the evaluations is that the modifications are not linked to the limitations, or sometimes students don't even suggest modifications. And so here's what I would suggest to avoid that. A good way to do is write each modification directly after each limitation. Now you need a minimum of 3 limitations, because again you have to evaluate the design, the sample, and the procedures. And so here we can see I've taken this one from my example IA, which is in the internal assessment teacher support pack, which I've linked in the description. We see my limitation. So I've got 3 limitations at least, and I explain the limitation. And then here I can say one suggested modification would be to use a match pairs, and so my modification is linked to the limitation. Again, here okay, one modification could be, and again you can see I'm using the word modification, using the language of the rubric, the right terminology, to clearly show the examiner that I'm hitting each requirement. And so this is what I would do for explain the limitation and then directly following it. And again, use paragraphs, right? So one limitation and modification pairing for each paragraph. It's a really easy way to structure your answer. All right, number 2 mistake made in the evaluation is there's no mention of the theory or the model. And so most students explain their results and how their results relate to the background study that they conducted. And a lot of students, and this was quite surprising, but a lot of students don't even mention the background theory or model. Now it's important, it's imperative. You actually don't have to mention the background study. You definitely must mention the background theory or model. Now my advice would be, can your results be explained by the theory or model? So if your results are consistent with the original, you can probably use that theory or model to explain those results. And so if they can be explained, explain how. Now if they can't be, let's say your results perhaps contradict the theory, then perhaps come up with some reasons why you think they might not be able to be explained by the theory or model. Can you come up with some alternative explanations? And that could be a good way there of linking your results to the theory or the model. I still would suggest mentioning and linking your results to the original study if you've replicated the original study, because it kind of just makes sense to do that, even if they're not even if it's not required by the rubric. Having said that, that could be something you might skip. The mentioning the background study, the original study, could be something you might skip if you're worried about word count. Now we can see here, this is again taken from my example IA. This is I'm explaining my present study and relating it to the original study. And then here I explain it in relation to the background theory or model. Now, really looking at this, I would actually say I wonder if I would give myself 4 marks here, because this is quite a limited explanation. And when we look at the rubric later on, you'll see that there's a difference between describing the results in relation to the theory or model and discussing. And so I would perhaps say that might need a little bit more development to get 4 marks, but you never know. Okay, I still, the important thing here is that you're making, and actually, sorry, I should say, this one here is quite hard to explain because in relation to the background theory model because my results contradict it. But anyway, focus on linking to the theory or the model. That's imperative. The number one mistake students make in their evaluation, and it's so painful because it's so easy to avoid. The number one mistake is they do not include evaluations of all three of these factors. Now, the rubric clearly says you need to include design, sample, and procedures, strengths, limitations, and modifications for all three. And you can even use headings and subheadings, to include, right? Evaluation of design, evaluation of sample, evaluation of procedures. Even if you do something like that, you're not going to get marked down for having subheadings. Just really make it really, really clear that you are hitting all three criteria. Right, and so that's what I would suggest that you can use headings and subheadings. Right, so there we have it. There are the 5 biggest mistakes that I see when I'm moderating IA. So my best advice is use the rubric as a checklist. Right, when we're moderating IAs, we can't deviate from the rubric. If it says it in the rubric, that's our Bible, that's our gospel, that's what we have to stick by. I would attempt all requirements, even if you're not 100% confident. So, even if you're not sure of a limitation of the design, or you think you're making a weak point, include it. You have to at least attempt to have all of the requirements met. And one thing I would do I would order your evaluative points from the strongest to weakest. Let's say for example your limit. So I would suggest going strength, and then limitation, modification, limitation, modification, limitation, modification. Now, how do you do the order? I would go by your strongest. So if you think you've got a really good point to make about how your sample was limited, begin with that one in your series of limitations. Or if you think that your design, you've got an excellent way of explaining the limitation of your design, begin with your strongest point. Right? Because, this is just like, I would suggest this for any essay. You want to start with your best foot forward, start with the best point, win over your examiner, show them you know what you're talking about, and then you kind of just hide the weaker points to later in the essay after you've already scored your marks. So that's my best advice. Now, if we look at the rubric, here we can see we want to get in the 5 to 6 range. So you have to, the investigation needs to be discussed with reference to the background theory or model. There's no mention of the background study. That's really important to remember. Strengths and limitations. Now here we can see strengths and limitations of the design, sample, and procedure. In the middle mark band, it says strengths and limitations of the design, sample, or procedure are stated. So it's clear, it's so clear. To get full marks, you have to have all three. They need to be explained and relevant to your investigation. Now, just a point here, limitations, a small sample size is not a valid limitation of the study, so don't even bother wasting the time explaining it. That is because every IB Psychology IA has a small sample size, and so it's not really showing any critical thinking. Here we have modifications need to be explicitly linked to the limitations. That's why I suggest having the modification directly following the limitation, and you need to fully justify it. And it should be easily justifiable if it's explicitly linked to the limitation. So that's the rubric. Again, just use that as your checklist. Now, failing that, now I'm going to have to move my little wee computer screen here. There we go. I'll hang over it on the left. This is the details from the checklist that I've just taken. This is a full Word document checklist is included in the Internal Assessment Teacher Support Pack. So if you're a teacher, you might want to check that out if you haven't got it already. But you can just pause and use this to check. Now, yep, yep, okay, that's all up to date. Okay, so that is that. Subscribe to the channel and the blog. We've got loads of resources there. That's the Internal Assessment Teacher Support Pack. If you've watched my series of videos now, you'll know what that's all about. And thank you. I hope this series of the top 5 limitations was helpful. If you've got questions about your IA, pop it in the comments. If it was helpful, leave a like. I think that does something to the YouTube algorithm, but I'm not really too worried about that. All right, thanks. Bye.